coming to our book launch presentation of Dr. Saskia Hollander, who will present her book, The Politics of Referendum Use in European Democracies. Obviously, very timely topic, especially in this country. I am Stijn van Kessel. I'm senior lecturer at Queen Mary at the School of Politics and International Relations. And I'll start with first things first. If in case there's a fire, there are two exits. This is probably the better to run through, and then you can follow the signs outside. There's also toilets down there, and also outside there if you turn the corner, first to the right and then again to the right. So having said that, this event is organized by the Center for European Research, which is led by my colleague Dr. Sarah Wolf, also from the School of Politics and International Relations. This is an interdisciplinary forum for the promotion of research and teaching on Europe. And the Center has recently been awarded a prestigious Jean Monnet Center for Excellence Award. And the associated 3-year program Next EUK will fund research, teaching and public engagement activities related to the future of EU-UK relations. So my colleagues and me rather, do research on Brexit in various shapes and forms. Our next event, if you're interested in this theme, will be on 9 December, a roundtable titled What's Next for British Democracy, with 4 experts, including 3 Queen Mary colleagues, and our guest, Prof. Pauline Schnabber from Sorbonne Nouvelle University. And the event is also supported by the Mile End Institute. And this institute is also hosted here. It brings together politicians, policymakers, academics, and the public to debate the major challenges facing the UK, so it's more focused on British politics, and its capital in a fast-moving world. But as I said, today we will discuss, and Dr. Saskia Hollander will present the book, The Politics of Referendum Use in European Democracies. Dr. Hollander is political scientist and director of knowledge management at The Broker, a knowledge brokering organization in the field of inclusive politics and economies based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And we are also lucky enough to have 2 renowned discussants who are leading experts on referendums. Their CVs are incredibly long, but I won't waste too much time, so I can't just do justice to their CVs. But I'll give a short summary. Professor Matt Kvortrup is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Coventry University, an expert in referendums, European politics and comparative government. He was awarded the PSA Prize in 2013 for his research on political institutions and policy outputs, and also the Oxford University Press Law Prize in the same year. On top of that, he is the editor of the international journal European Political Science Review, among many other activities. We also have Dr. Mario Mendes, who is based here at Queen Mary University. He's a reader in law, and his research interests are mainly in constitutional law, and one of his key interests is direct democracy. Recent projects related to this include a co-authored study on referendums on EU matters, published in 2017, that was prepared for the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, and he also co-authored a monograph, Referendums and the European Union, a comparative inquiry, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2014. So a real referendum dream team all in all. And I'll first give the floor to Dr. Hollander, then give some time to the discussants to respond, and then I'll open the floor for discussion, and the event will be until 8 o'clock, but that won't be close. So, Dr. Hollander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much, Stijn and CR for organizing. And of course also thank you, Matt and Mario, for participating and willing to give feedback on my book. So this afternoon we will talk about referendums, and specifically the question whether referendums are devices of the people or devices of the political elite. And this seems a weird question because after all, in referendums you vote on issues directly rather than voting on representatives to do this for you. But as I will show today, as I will argue today, some referendums are certainly more direct than others. But before that, first to go back a little bit in time, sorry. My referendum journey started in 2008, which was at a time that the appetite for referendums was a bit on its decline. Europe just had 4 referendums, but 2 were no to the European Constitution in France, and the one in my country, the Netherlands. And this was a clear rejection of the European Constitution. So after that, political enthusiasm for referendums declined. And this is strange because at the time of the referendums on the European Constitution, there was this discourse that referendums were necessary in order to solve the democratic deficit of the European Union. And it was a very strong discourse. Referendums were also held in Luxembourg and Spain on the Constitution, and many other countries, including this country, pledged to hold a referendum, but they were cancelled after the Dutch and French no. The alternative, the next treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, was ratified in all European countries without a referendum, except for Ireland. So there seemed to be a bit of a referendum silence. But this was a calm before the storm, because 10 years later, the referendums were clearly back on the agenda, and the Brexit referendum in this country was only one in a series of referendums on Europe. Denmark held a referendum in December 2000, I have to say it correctly, 2015, on whether to opt in on the justice pillar of the European Union. Greece, of course, had a referendum in July, that's the same year, on the bailout deal with the Eurozone. There was a referendum in my country in April 2016 on the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, and there was a referendum on the EU migrant quota in Hungary in 2016. And although these referendums are different, some being initiated by the government and others by citizens, what they had in common that they were all clear rejections of Europe. So we tend to refer to these referendums as offering people direct power. Yes, is this really the case? But the British people are still left in the dark about their future relationship with the European Union. And it's also questionable whether David Cameron really triggered this referendum to give the British people a direct vote. So, should referendums be seen as devices of the people or devices of the political elite? My book, my study, departed from two basic assumptions in the referendum literature. So the first is that the use of national referendums marks a shift from political decision-making by representation to decision-making by direct citizens' participation. And the second assumption is that because referendums are portrayed as an alternative to representative democracy, they are used as a direct response to a dissatisfaction with representative democracy. And the aim of my study was to examine the validity of both of these assumptions. So how did I do this? The research design consisted of two parts. First, I examined the availability of referendum legislation and their use in 28 European member states between 1950 and 2017. And thereby I still included the UK. Secondly, I conducted a comparative case study analysis of 5 countries: France, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and the Netherlands. These countries have a different referendum tradition and a different frequency with which referendums are held. Most referendums were held in Denmark, and then France with 10 referendums, then the United Kingdom, Sweden with 5, the United Kingdom with 3, and the Netherlands with 2 referendums. And this excludes the referendum that was held in 2018, which fell outside the time frame of my study. But what I first did is I provided a classification of referendums. In the referendum literature, a lot of classifications are being provided. I chose to distinguish referendums on the basis of the actor who's triggering the vote. And 2 questions are important. Either are they triggered by political representatives or by citizens. And the second question is whether these groups constitute a majority in decision-making or a minority. So then on the upper left, we first have the legislative majority referendum, which is triggered by a majority in parliament, mostly at the initiative of governments. And then we have presidential referendums, of course only possible in presidential systems, triggered by the president, and since the president either holds a majority by the public or by parliament, I put this in the left upper side. Then there are legislative, I always always struggle with this. Years ago, minority referendum, which is triggered by opposition parties, and this form is mainly found in consensus democracy, most democracies. And then at the bottom side we have referendums initiated by citizens themselves. This can either be on legislation that is already approved by Parliament, which is a citizen veto, or a referendum on an issue that citizens have drawn themselves, which are called citizen initiatives. And then at a final form there is the mandatory referendum, usually on constitutional revisions or EU treaty reforms. And this referendum is difficult to place in this framework because it's not triggered by an actor but by the Constitution. But what I found in my research that even these referendums, which are on paper they are mandatory, governments have a clear say in whether these referendums are being held or not. Of course, the position of these referendums also depends on other features, such as whether the vote is binding or advisory, whether there is a turnout threshold, and the range of issues on which referendum can be held. So to come back to the first research question, has there been an increase in referendum legislation and the use in the EU 28 between 1950 and 2017? The answer is yes and no. Yes, in terms of legislation. There are more and more countries have adopted referendum legislation in their constitution. And currently there are only 5 countries in the European Union where the constitution does not entail provisions for the holding of referendums, which are Belgium, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Germany and my own country. Of course, in these countries referendums can be held on the local level and also on an ad hoc basis by a parliamentary majority. But the answer is no in terms of use. First of all, there is no constant growth in the use of referendums. Although the number of countries where referendums are held have increased, referendum use tends to peak around key events such as a constitutional consolidation or EU treaty reforms. This is shown in the, I don't know if this, okay, it is clear. In this figure I made a distinction between the EU 17, which include the old EU member states plus Malta and Cyprus, and these are the red bars. And you can see in this group of countries that there has been an increase in the 1990s, but afterwards it's on its decline. But then the green bars is the same group without Ireland and Italy, and this really distorts the figure, as you say. If you don't count these countries in, then not so much is going on, up to 5 to 10 referendums in 10 years. And then the last group, the blue bars, is the Central and Eastern European countries. These countries use a lot of referendums, especially since the 1990s. I only counted these referendums from the 1989 when they made the transition to the democracy. And you see that there's, in each time frame, referendums are used quite often. So does this now entail a shift to direct democracy? Based on referendum use, not, but even if you, especially not when you look at the types of referendums used. As I said, in all countries, even those countries which have no referendum legislation in their constitution, referendums can still be organized by a parliamentary majority, and these are then advisory. And to compare, in only 10 countries can citizens themselves initiate a referendum, and that's mainly Italy and some of the Central and Eastern European countries. In my country, this was possible between 2015 and 2018, but then the current government, made a decision to abolish the referendum law. And if you look at the use, in most old EU member states, referendums are triggered by a parliamentary majority, and mostly at the initiative of the government. This is shown in this figure as well. If you look at the first column, you see that the first column includes Italy and Ireland, and you see that 40% of the referendums are triggered by citizens, and this is because almost all of these referendums were held in Italy. And this can be shown if you look at the second, because then it's only 2 referendums, one in Malta and one in my country, which were triggered by citizens. And for the final group, it's a bit different. Here you see that most referendums are indeed triggered by citizens themselves, but it has to be said that in these countries, many of these referendums were invalid because the turnout threshold was not reached. So I have to drink a bit. So, in the old member states, the conclusion is that most referendums are indeed triggered by political representatives. So then the question becomes, why do politicians pledge referendums? So there are two dominant lines of thinking in the referendum literature. One being sociological institutionalism, which argues that referendums are increasingly held because of democratic values, because of democratic values that people attach to referendums. And these can be intrinsic values, meaning that referendums are seen as means to enhance political participation, which is seen as an end, a goal in democracy in itself. Or instrumental values in which referendums are seen as a means to solve a democratic deficit or to increase democratic legitimacy. The other line of thinking is rational choice institutionalism, which says referendums are being held because of the strategic functions that referendums have in the democratic decision making. The first being policy seeking, so referendums can be triggered to enforce an outcome that is voted down by Parliament. Empowerment, meaning that referendums are held to strengthen the position of the actor who triggers the vote. Conflict mediation, which means that the referendum can be held to smoothen controversy over a certain issue. And depoliticization, meaning that the referendum can be held to make sure that the issue does not interfere with general elections. So there are not many studies that examine these referendum functions in a comparative perspective. So what I did in these 5 countries, in France, Denmark, the UK, Sweden and the Netherlands, I reconstructed the debates leading up to the referendums and see whether either democratic values or strategic interests were in place. What I found is that in almost all referendums, the politicians who pledged the referendum, they would refer to these democratic values, either because referendums would boost political participation, or because the democracy legitimacy has to be boosted. But sorry, I'm going a bit too fast. But I also found that for many referendums, almost all deliberate referendum pledges, strategic interests were in place. So what I will do now is for each referendum function, I will give some examples, not all, because there are too many, but I think we can, in a discussion, we can delve into specific examples more in detail. So the first is policy seeking. This is outcome continued, meaning that the referendum is being held to enforce a certain political outcome. So when there is insufficient support in Parliament for a policy proposal, a referendum can be used to enforce a decision on this, to enforce the proposal anyway, thereby circumventing or bypassing Parliament. But this is not a very common referendum strategy because it's largely seen as undemocratic to bypass Parliament. But it's when the opposition triggers a referendum, this is by definition policy seeking because they want to circumvent the political majority. But there are also some instances where governments have used the referendum for policy-seeking motives. And the most obvious examples are the referendums by the French President de Gaulle. De Gaulle had a very difficult relationship with Parliament, so he used the referendum to enforce his policy proposals anyway. But also the Danish referendum on the Single European Act in 1986 is an example. The Single European Act was voted down in Parliament, and in Denmark it's very difficult to avoid a referendum on the European Union because the Constitution states that in case of a sovereignty transfer, a referendum should be held if there's no 5/6 majority in Parliament in favor of the treaty. And given the fragmentation in Danish politics, this is very difficult to obtain. But in this case, there was no 5/6 majority, but it was also not a sufficient majority to enforce this referendum, because then 50%, at least 50% of Parliament should be in favour. This was not the case. The government wanted to ratify the Single European Act, was also forced by European leaders to find a solution. So he called an advisory referendum, and then the Danish people voted yes. And then he said, okay, I have the people backing me, so I can still ratify the Single European Act. Other examples are the Swedish referendums on the driving side, the pensions and nuclear energy. But this was not so much because the government wanted to bypass a parliament, but because it's actually, how do you say it in English? I'm sorry. It's enshrined in Swedish politics to have a minority government. So in this case, there was no majority for each of the policy proposals. So in these cases, the referendum was necessary to enforce any decision. This strategy is also common in EU negotiations, because in European Union negotiations, a referendum can be used to enhance the bargaining power of the political leader who triggers it. And a very timely example is the Brexit referendum. Cameron promised to conduct renegotiations with the European Union in order to secure a special status in the EU. And after these negotiations, he wanted to hold a referendum on it. So this forecast of the referendum, with this forecast of this referendum, Cameron really hoped to get a better deal for the UK in Europe. And of course, you all know this failed. Other examples of referendums that were held to enhance the bargaining power are the Swedish referendum on EU accession and the euro. The last one is interesting because Sweden does not have opt-out from the euro like the UK or Denmark. And so that means that when it adheres to the convergence criteria, it had to adopt the euro. So Sweden chose deliberately to not adhere to these criteria so that it does not have to join the euro. And because of the referendum, which led it to a no, this decision was legitimized and accepted by the European leaders. So these are all examples of referendums held for outcome contingent reasons, but most of the referendums that I analyzed were held because were act contingent, meaning that it was not so much the outcome of the referendum that was at stake, but the referendum, but the act in itself that was seen beneficial. For example, winning elections or preventing a coalition split. First act contingent motive is enhancing the legitimacy of the actor that triggers the vote. This is especially common for referendums that are triggered by governments, and especially presidential referendums. And also this is a typical referendum strategy if the government leader or the president is certain that the public is on their side. So examples of referendums held for empowerment motives are the French presidential referendums, and the Danish referendums on the euro and the unified patent. Because as I said, in Denmark it's very difficult to avoid a referendum on euro because of the constitutional requirement. But in these cases, it was not so much the fact that the referendum was held, but the timing of the referendum. Because in both cases, in that moment, the public was on the side of the government. And especially in the last one, the Unified Patent Court, this was really a victory. It was the Unified Patent Court was agreed on during the Danish presidency of the European Union. So it was really seen as if the Danish would vote yes. It was really how do you say it? Cherry on the pie. I don't know how you say that in English. So it was really, it would boost the legitimacy of the incumbent government. Also, parties in opposition or citizen groups can use the referendum as empowerment tool, and then it's specifically to bring down the government or to boost their own position vis-à-vis the government. This was the case in the Dutch referendum on the Ukraine association agreement with the EU. So, as I said, this referendum was triggered by citizens, not by the government, and was on the basis of a petition. And the referendum was organized by 3 Eurosceptic organizations, and they said in an interview right before the referendum, they didn't really care about Ukraine. They just awaited the first moment to use this new referendum legislation to really distort relations with the European Union. Interestingly, two of the initiators formed a political party, and one of them was really successful during the last parliamentary election. So for this political party, this strategy really worked. And a very common referendum strategy is conflict mediations. Referendums are very often held to smoothen conflicts within political parties or a government coalition over controversial issues. And especially Europe is an issue that splits political parties and coalitions, not only in this country. So when a party or coalition disagrees on a certain issue, it can pay off to submit it to a referendum in order to flip the coin to one side or the other. I found many examples of this strategy. For example, all the French referendums on the European Union, because both the center-left and the center-right in French politics are divided over Europe. And maybe I should not go through all of them. Yeah, of course, worth mentioning is, of course, the Brexit referendum, which is a very clear example of a conflict mediation strategy. As you all know, the Conservative Party was there, really split over Europe, and Cameron really tried to curtail this Euroscepticism within his own party by triggering a referendum. And this is interesting because years before, in 2011, he declined to hold a referendum on the same issue. But at that time, the competition, there were of course elections. At the time, the competition from UKIP was so large that it was kind of forced to hold a referendum anyway. Let me see. Yeah. So the last referendum strategy is depoliticization, and I'm always struggling with this word. So there are some English words that are really difficult for Dutch people. So this has been a common motive in especially in the post-Maastricht EU referendums, because Euroscepticism was increasing. And in this period, referendums became increasingly used to make sure that EU affairs did not interfere with general elections. This is, of course, especially the case when faced with Eurosceptic political parties. So by promising the electorate a referendum, a separate vote on an EU affair, political parties can prevent that these issues become decisive in elections. So examples are again the French referendum on the European Constitution, which was pledged by French President Jacques Chirac at the time when elections were coming, and at the time also when the Front National, a Eurosceptic Front National, became very successful in French politics. And this party was also able to couple this, to link the European Constitution issue to the Turkish accession of the European Union, even boosting Euroscepticism. Then the Danish referendum, the recent referendum on its opt-out from justice in 2015. Again, not because the vote was held, but again the timing was very made it susceptible to depoliticization strategy. Initially, this referendum was to be held alongside the Unified Patents Court referendum, but for this specific issue, the government knew, okay, the public is not on my side; it will probably a no. Let's overhevelen. Let's vote on this issue after the elections to make sure that it does not interfere with the referendum on the UPC, but also not in the general elections. And then, of course, the Brexit referendum. I started with the autobiography of Cameron, and there he made it very clear that he had no choice to hold a referendum due to the competition from UKIP. Also, the Swedish referendums were all issues on which elections could possibly be lost. So, and that these referendum strategies can easily backlash is of course seen by the recent Brexit. Not so recent, but by the Brexit vote. For scientists, that's recent. But so, to come back to one of my research questions, are referendums a response to dissatisfaction with representative democracy? I would say no. Of course, in all referendums I investigated, normative arguments played a role in the public debates. But when politicians determine whether a referendum is held, and in most cases the political elites do determine this, then interest determine whether a referendum is held or not. And the fact that there was only one country holding a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty in 2008 underscores this argument. Sometimes referendums are held because they have to be held to enforce a certain outcome, but most referendums were deemed beneficial to achieve something else, for example, winning elections or preventing a coalition or a party split. Yet the discourse that portrays referendums as an expression of popular sovereignty and as a response to discontent with representative democracy is very strong. And this is not in the last place because of the people who initiate the referendum use this argument to legitimize their referendums. And these arguments become especially salient as an outcome of the populist appeal to referendums, both by the populist left and the populist right. So this sounds like an open door that governments. I have to say, governments would not adhere to this populist appeal, but populist parties simply put governments on the defensive. And this really sounds as an open door, but it's important because the discourse that portrays referendums as device of the people is very strong. And as I would say, it also raises expectations of referendums that they simply do not meet. So to conclude, my book could be read as a plea to be aware of these interests underlying referendum calls, because only then we can assess their role in democratic decision making, which was basically mine.
Thank you very much.
That's super, yeah.
I was told to put this on.
Yes.
But maybe a bit late to connect to the Wi-Fi. But
Oh yes. Well, if you still want to connect to the Wi-Fi, although it's not working very well these days, I think. Yes, please. Thanks so much for this fascinating presentation, and this is, of course, and these very relevant conclusions. I also would say, especially in this context. I'll give the floor first to Professor Matt Kvortrup. First of all, Nat, you say on the back of the book, both experts and ordinary voters should read this book. Do you still think that is the case?
Yes. Yeah, you press the button.
Yes. Right, I don't know if you can hear me. Should I stand up as well?
What do you prefer?
Yeah, I think I prefer to stand up, actually.
Sure.
Is there a microphone up there? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just take... How long have I got? Or how little have I got?
10 or so minutes.
10 or so minutes, that's fine.
But you've come all the way from Coventry, so...
Yeah, and Canada before that.
You can take
No, it's fine to... as Tony Blair once says, there's nothing that cannot be said in 3 bullet points of 35 seconds. I'm not sure that's true for the Iraq War. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about here today. So, when I got this book, I think I have to declare an interest, actually, Saskia. You may not know this. About 3 years ago, I was sent a manuscript by a publisher asking if I would be happy to review it. And I read it and I thought, this is a pretty good book. And I said, yeah, just publish it. Which I think I had a few comments that you might have struggled over and you might have thought I was a bastard. But who knows? So I've seen this book in various forms. I did not know that I was quoted on the back of it because the publisher didn't have the decency to send it. Anyway, and when I was pondering this, I thought I would sort of start bombastically and with like I thought something along the lines of a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of the referendum, that sort of Karl Marx sort of way. And I thought it would even go on to say that, the old Europe have entered into an unholy alliance to exercise the spectre, the European Union, Angela Merkel, the British Conservatives, and even Dutch radicals. And I thought it was like the people versus the, that sort of, I think the guy called Boris Johnson is the people versus the parliament and all of that sort of thing. And then when I started, reading this book, above all, and also when I started looking at the cases, I realised that many of these are examples of the people versus the so-called elites. It's sort of funny thing that elites are okay in sport, but they're not okay in anything else. Actually, most referendums, when you think of it, are not bottom-up, they're top-down. And they're a party political device. What is interesting about many of these referendums, which kind of what you say, so I'll first say what I agree with, and I'll say the various things I may disagree with, and I'm hoping I'm not overlapping with you, Mary, with a brief word about that. Anyway, what is interesting about a lot of referendums is that lots of people somebody once said that people would not call a referendum, or that's actually Aaron Leipart, your compatriot, says no government would call a referendum if they expect, they only call it when they expect to win. And the problem about it is that then they really get it wrong. I think that's what I at some stage called the Britney Spears theory of politics. Oops, they did it again. And you sort of like, you do a thing that sounds like a fantastically good idea, and then it sort of blows up in your face. And in a number of referendums where they've tried to be tactical about it, and I think you mentioned a couple of these cases, they backfire. And David Cameron's was a classic example of, oops, he did it again. But so too was Mitterrand in 1992. I don't think there was so much necessarily internal. He wanted to embarrass the right, and then suddenly, and they were duly split, but he also almost lost the referendum. Rasmussen in 2000 had this referendum. He thought he was going to win it. He didn't. Persson in Sweden in 2003 mentioned, and Balkenende in 2005. So all of these have blown up in their faces. And these are all sort of fairly mainstream politicians, but even politicians of a sort of more populist or illiberal democratic bent, or illiberal undemocratic bent, like Viktor Orban. And I think you mentioned that he won that referendum. Well, it was very embarrassing because it was deemed. The turnout wasn't met, and it was a deliberate boycott. And actually, the only time Viktor Orban has lost an electoral contest was that one. So he can also blow up in their faces. This idea about the spectre that's haunting Europe is actually not the spectre of the referendum, it's the spectre of miscalculating elites who have things that blow up in their faces. So I think that when people are talking about referendums and we shouldn't have it, and it's because we should just leave it to the politicians, well, we are leaving it to the politicians, and the politicians decide to have referendums about issues that actually benefit themselves. And then I think what is interesting is that the places where you could actually have the referendum as a people's veto, a Roman historian called Tacitus, who said that on smaller matters the chieftains decide, on great matters the people decide. And I think it should be for the people to decide on the great matters. But then sometimes it should also be for the people to decide when they want to decide on an issue. Brexit was number 14 in priorities here in Britain, and then suddenly Cameron decides to do that because he's afraid that Farage will get too many votes. But maybe there could be ways in which the people themselves could decide. Now, I was sort of a little bit surprised when I saw the original manuscript that Italy wasn't in the book, because I thought Italy would be an obvious case, and Hungary possibly as well, because they do have the citizen-initiated referendums. I mean, in Italy, a law was passed that the Prime Minister could not go on trial. It was passed by Berlusconi. I wonder why. But, he thought that would be a good idea. And the people then duly collect the 500,000 signatures, had a vote on it, 93%, I beg your pardon, on a 55% turnout, I think, decided to annul that law, and Berlusconi was duly put on trial, had to do community service, and that was the end of him. And then, so people may say that Italy is ungovernable and so on, but it's not because of the people; it's because of the elites. So I mean, I suppose these are just sort of remarks of things you could have put, and I suppose it might also have been interesting to look at some of the East European or Central European countries, because they do have the citizens-initiated referendum, like Slovenia, for example. It's a relatively well-functioning system. And then just sort of a couple of things that I was sort of pondering, where I mean, we do agree on this idea that sometimes you agree to disagree referendum. And I think you mentioned that in the book, and I'll sort of spell it out a bit more. That you mentioned that. And for example, all the Swedish referendums have always been, whenever the Social Democrats are not in, then the conservative or liberal or bourgeois parties in Sweden basically agree on a little bit more sort of free enterprise and not being Social Democrats. And they always have the problem that there is a centre party in Sweden which is anti-nuclear energy, anti-the EU, but they're also sort of anti-the Social Democrats. So therefore they share something with the Conservatives. And in 1980, when they got into power after 37 years in opposition, they decided to have a referendum on nuclear power because they couldn't agree. Next time they get in the early 1990s, they can't agree in the EU, and they kick it out to the voters. So that's a fairly common pattern. I think also the Danes have had that a bit, and we had here with the Lib Dems and the Conservative Party when Nick Clegg, if you remember him, of Facebook lately, decided that we should have this vote on what he used to call the miserable little compromise. That was the alternative vote. But that was also because they agreed to disagree. Then the only thing I fundamentally disagree with you on is the Danish one, where you say that in Denmark you can't really avoid having a referendum. And I'm interested to hear how you reach that conclusion, because the Danes, after they had the referendum on the single European currency, did not have a referendum on the Nice Treaty, they did not have a referendum on the European Constitution, and they did not have a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. And then you might say that, well, they just needed a period. And the Danish government decided that there wasn't a transfer of sovereignty. Now, in Ireland, there was transfer of sovereignty, and some Danish people decided that they should appeal that to the Danish Supreme Court. And the Danish Supreme Court says, oh, well, we can't really answer that question because we're a Supreme Court, we're not a constitutional court. So what I think what is interesting about the Danish case is the Danish government decides when they transfer sovereignty. It's a political decision, whereas in Ireland, after the Crotty case, I mean, that's probably Mendes's area, I'll shut up about that. So I think some of the legal rules and the leeway, if you like, is not always there. But again, I will quote the person who wrote on the back of the book and said that ordinary people should read this as well as talking heads like me. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Dr. Mendes, would you like to comment, please?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today to discuss Saskia's fascinating new book. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm a law academic here at Queen Mary, so unlike the rest of the panel who are political scientists, and perhaps in that sense I perhaps don't have necessarily the best toolkit to address some aspects of this important book that Saskia has written. But I do have research interests in direct democracy and the EU, as noted also at the beginning. And I'm pleased to say that I learnt a great deal from reading Saskia's excellent book on Politics of Referendum Use in European Democracies. Really a tremendous amount of work has obviously gone into this, and there's much valuable insight in there, and I can say that you certainly do not have to be a political scientist, and I'm not one, to benefit from reading this. I wanted to focus on 4 to 5 issues in the minutes that I have, and starting with one that overlaps with Professor Kortrup's observations in relation essentially to the case studies that were selected for the book. So, as you probably do when you pick up a book as an academic or a non-academic for the first time and flick through the contents pages, as I did that with this book initially, I looked and I thought, five case studies in 5 different countries: France, Denmark, the UK, Sweden, and the Netherlands. And given the broader topic of referendums in Europe, which itself is broader than referendums in the European Union, I did wonder about that case selection. Now, obviously, you then flick through the book and a justification is offered for that case selection, both in the introduction to the book and in the conclusion to the book. But I thought it would be useful if Saskia might say a little bit more about the justification for those 5 countries, in light, obviously, of the fact that, for example, as Matt also pointed out, you've got Central and Eastern European countries that have significant referendum use. And then I would also, in relation to that point, I'd also query the reference to France as being a frequent user of referendums. So as I looked at the 5 case studies, I looked at them and thought, okay, the country I know best, the UK, in this context. One I know to some extent as well, France, Sweden and the Netherlands, those 4. And I thought, well, these are 4, for me, non-frequent users of referendums. In fact, only one of them, I thought, as I looked at it, counts as a frequent user of referendums, and that is Denmark. Because for France, when was the last referendum? If you're French, you haven't been asked for your vote in a referendum on any issue if you're under 30 years old, right? The last time was the 2005 Constitutional Treaty referendum. So I wonder, again, if a bit more might be said about case selection, whether that presents, whether it might present a different picture if different cases had been focused on, while I do recognise that obviously there is the preceding chapter exploring referendum provisions and use across the 28 countries, and much valuable work is in there as well. So that was the first point about case study selection. The second point was about the emphasis in the book on referendums being held by and to serve the interests of political elites, and most notably the executive branch. And I was thinking, if I'd been asked that question before looking at this book, maybe I wouldn't have known the answer to that question. Have more been held in that context or not? But reading through the book, I very much liked the fact that you underscored, and you did it partly in the presentation as well, the fact that what is often thought of as being a constitutionally mandatory referendum is in fact frequently giving scope for political discretion as to whether a referendum should be held. And I think it's too common in the literature, both by lawyers and political scientists, to treat that category of so-called constitutionally mandatory referendums as if there is no discretion whatsoever there in relation to whether a referendum should be held, when in fact there can indeed be discretion in that respect. But, and to use an example, Ireland could even be used as an example that's often lost sight of. In fact, in the Irish context, and Professor Courtrup alluded to this, it's Supreme Court jurisprudence in Ireland that required a referendum to be held on the Single European Act in the mid-1980s. But in fact, there is an argument that not all of the referendums that Ireland has since held on EU revising treaties were actually as such mandatory. Rather, there's an argument that could be made that in fact, if you're the Irish government, you pretty much feel like you're obligated to hold a referendum, such as on the Nice Treaty, because otherwise litigants will bring proceedings against you and this ends up in court, and that's politically damaging for you. Whichever way the ruling goes, it's problematic for you. So that is illustrating, though, the point that there is arguably some scope for discretion. But I wonder whether you are actually seeing more discretion than there actually is. So I credit you for introducing there being discretion in this context, which I think is missing from much of the literature, but I wonder whether you're seeing more discretion than there actually is in this context. So it'd be good if you might say something more about that, because that plays into the whole argument that really it's elites that are strategically using referendums. I see personally that there's less discretion than you are suggesting, even in the constitutionally mandatory referendums. A related point would be to do with not legally obligatory referendums, whether in Ireland or elsewhere, but the notion of potentially politically obligatory referendums. And I know in your talk, but also in the book, that Sweden, which pops up rightly regularly, it's one of the case studies obviously, and how you see, for example, the accession referendum of Sweden, held in the mid-1990s, and the joining the single currency referendum. Because can't we see those two examples as in fact politically obligatory referendums, rather than necessarily there being much political discretion here? That is to say that when Sweden joins the European Union, at a time when its fellow Nordic neighbours are all holding referendums on joining the European Union, can Sweden really get away with joining, regardless of what its constitutional text might say, can it really get away with joining the European Union in the mid-1990s, given the implications for your sovereignty that EU membership has, without holding a referendum? Can Sweden really, not legally, but politically speaking, can Sweden really sign up to the single currency in the early 2000s when its Nordic neighbour, Denmark, has rejected single currency membership in a referendum a few years earlier? So I wonder whether we can't say, well, they look like they're politically obligatory, those referendums, rather than introducing, rather than arguing that in fact there was significant discretion there. And then the third, turning to a third point, all your chapters, all your case studies conclude with sections on the future of referendums in that relevant country that you look at. And I wonder to what extent, given the emphasis on referendums being primarily executive-led, the recent experiences with referendums, Brexit being an obvious example where they can blow up, as Professor Kortrup rightly points out, as you do as well in your book, whether that points to a lesson to be learned for the political elites, which is they need to be very, very careful, especially in a context where social media is being used and disinformation is being propagated via social media, giving you even less control over the referendum, to a future in which actually the referendum is less likely to be used. And related to that point is the future of referendums on the European Union. That one of the lessons, it seems to me, that the elites at the EU level have taken from the negative experiences and the negative fallout of these referendums held on EU treaty revisions is, let's not have EU treaty revisions. And it's quite telling, it seems to me, that the last time we had a major treaty revision was the Lisbon Treaty. And you might say, oh, but that wasn't that long ago, that was only 10 years ago. But the text of the Lisbon Treaty is really the text of the draft constitutional treaty. That's 2003. This is 16 years old. So I wonder whether one of the lessons that is emerging is that we're not going to have, in fact, referendums on EU issues because they're not going to have treaty revision. And then the very final brief point would be, so in effect the fifth observation would be, might it be said that the normative implications that flow from your study and political elites controlling the use of the referendum to use when they wish to, not the people, is that we might think about institutionalising the device in constitutional systems and taking away much of that discretion from elites by having bottom-up referendums, Central and Eastern European style perhaps, but again that's one of the case studies that's not looked at in your study, or constitutional amendment related referendums, which links to Professor Kortrup's point about having the referendums on the big constitutional issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both discussants, for these excellent comments. I'll give first the opportunity to Saskia to respond, but I ask you to be relatively selective in order to leave enough time for the questions from the audience. Here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you, Matt and Mario, for your nice words, but also for your critical views. I always have a difficulty with collecting these and then be brief, but I will try to combine some. I think I will start with the last one, which is always easy, but I think that's also good to have a discussion on later, because actually I really underscore at this point it would be much better if referendums are institutionalized, are in the constitution, then the bottom-up referendum would be, if you ask me, on a normative level, that would, I think that's only direct. That's the only form of pure direct democracy. And I think my own country, Netherlands, is a very interesting case because and I didn't delve into this in my presentation because it would be too long. But as I said, our country does not have referendum legislation in the constitution, but it has been an issue for decades. We have a system. It's very difficult to change our constitution. There have to be election in between, and then by qualified majority it has to be proven. And there were over the years many proposals to introduce the referendum. And interestingly, only a citizen-initiated referendums. Never was there a discussion on whether we should have referendums by parliamentary majority. Not even the constitutional referendum. I think it was discussed in the 60s. But later on, it was only the citizen-initiated referendum that was being discussed, and where proposals were formulated. So I think it's not a good case because it has now been abolished. So even if there is legislation, political parties can turn it back, so to say. But if you would ask me, I it's completely agree. I think I would just go the other way around.
Sure.
Because also, about the future of referendums, and it's always difficult for political scientists to make predictions. I think most of them, they don't make predictions. And I have to say that when I wrote this book, it was pre-Brexit. So at that time, there was the enthusiasm for referendums was back. And then when I headed into Palgrave, then all the things changed. So I had to revise. Therefore, it took so long in the end. But I think what you see now, it's not only that governments are reluctant to hold referendums, they're also reluctant to have this major treaty revisions. And I think there's a very interesting article by, and I can never pronounce his name, you can do it better, Shimon Fen? Which actually touches upon this issue, that because of this referendum forecast, and you can decide whether that's good or not good. I think that's the reality that we have to deal with. I think I will say something about case selection because there were many comments on this. What I wanted to do, I agree with you, it would have been nice to include Italy. It would have been nice to include one of the Central and Eastern European countries, at least a country where referendums by citizens are possible. But this was not the aim of my study. I departed from the idea, from the notion that referendums are held because political elites think they should be held because of normative reasons, because they have to solve the democratic deficit or they have to boost participation. So therefore, I almost deliberately chose not to include countries where the most of the referendums are held by citizens, which of course it's selecting on a dependent variable. From a political scientist point of view, that's not very popular, how do you say? But I think even in Italy, many of the referendums that are initiated by citizens are hijacked by political parties. And I think you know the Italian case much better than I do. But I think that that also applies to Central and Eastern European countries. And I think the Dutch referendum on the EU Association Agreement is a very good example. So even if we have a referendum that is organized by citizens, by petition, then still you have to be aware of why are they calling a referendum and which political parties join their cause, I would say. So why then these 5 countries? And I completely agree. France was a struggle because if you look at the whole, you select 28 countries, then France, it should be at the lower. 10 is not that much, and especially because after 2005 no referendum has been held. But if you exclude the Central and Eastern European countries and then look at the old member states without Italy and Ireland, then then 10 is more than in the other. But it's ambiguous, it's arbitrary, so to say. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to compare countries which were similar in terms of political system or more or less similar. So I chose the United Kingdom and France because they're both majoritarian democracies. And also it shows some countries which are consensus democracies, so the Netherlands, Denmark and Sweden. So I think this mixed design allowed me to really look at the referendum motives in different political constellation, and also test the validity of my conclusions as well. Do I still have time?
It's your part.
Let me see. About Denmark. Yeah, I think this is an interesting point. Maybe I said it too bluntly, because I think that in the literature, Denmark is very often referred to as countries where referendums on Europe are unavoidable. Yeah. And not what I wanted to show, but what I show is that this is not the case. I think that I show exactly what you say, but maybe no, because that really might, like, even in countries with a very constitutional requirement to hold referendums on Europe, they can still be avoided or used strategically. And I didn't mention that one, but Denmark also avoided a referendum on the fiscal compact, and Ireland did have a referendum on it. Ireland did not have a referendum on the banking union. You can say that especially for Ireland, if there have been so many referendums, they avoided the referendum on the banking union. It's kind of tricky. So I think it underscores the point that you both are making that even mandatory referendums are not that mandatory. Shall I leave it by?
Yeah,
this?
I think
Okay.
the audience is dying to ask some questions, but an excellent response to these excellent comments. Anyone who would like to ask a question? Yes, the gentleman there. No other takers? Yeah, I think you can go. Oh, the microphone's coming now.
Thank you very much for your presentation. One or two thoughts occurred to me. Some politicians have got a 100% record on referenda, winning every one. Tony Blair never lost one. Harold Wilson had one, which he won. The other point is certainly talked about bottom-up referenda. I think Switzerland has had more referenda than it's had hot dinners, and you only need so many signatures to trigger a referenda. So you had one on things like the deep tunnel under the Alps a few years ago, and that's one. Some referenda, not 50-50, they can be 60-40 or other. And if Cameron had, say, 55-45, he would have won the referendum. And just a last thought was that referenda are very often used by dictators to justify. The Nazis were very fond of referenda on things like the Anschluss with Austria, the union with the Tsar in 1935, and I think there were other ones as well, which, not surprisingly, because they had a huge propaganda machine, he would win with 80% of the vote. And I don't think David Cameron would have died for something like that. Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Yes, gentleman over there.
Well, I'm just thinking that I'm thinking that in this research, were you influenced or needed to consider the simplicity or complexity of the questions? Because it seems with referendum, the more simple it is, then you get a result. But otherwise, it continues on a more difficult path. And also, perhaps what was mentioned on Switzerland, perhaps they don't have trouble with referendums because they have so many, whereas perhaps if in your study the referendum, there are less referendums, is it a bigger deal, more of a problem when there is one?
One final question for this round before I let the speakers. Yes, sorry.
Thanks. I guess I also wanted to refer back to Switzerland, although I know you've not focused on that, sorry. I wondered if you do consider that as, in shorthand, politically tainted as the others that you've talked about, or is it a factor when you do get more referenda, there's a sort of evening out that goes on? And I also wanted to, I suppose related to that, that when there are very few referenda, and I'm thinking of the Brexit referendum here, and also the one that you referred to, the Ukraine one in Holland, that I mean, I had some connection with the people involved in that, and it seemed to me that that was about the only chance that people had to have some opinion on the whole of the EU's trade agenda, which they'd been fighting and opposing for so long, but hadn't had any say on it. And so you kind of dismiss that as being politically motivated for a political end. But there's also the aspect that that was probably the first time they ever got a chance to say anything on an EU trade agreement. And of course, I know that your study hasn't looked at this at all, but the aspect of the results of referenda, so the ones on the EU constitution in Holland and France, I believe, I think they're in the same weekend, both voted against it. And what did the EU do? Just change the name of it. So it's quite a big issue if you're going to have a referenda, and that's what comes out of it.
Saskia, and then I'll also let the other panelists respond.
Yeah, no, I think that this is a very good point. I think it's actually funny that we are discussing referendums for 1.5 hours, and before the discussion, Switzerland didn't. I think that's good, because I think Switzerland is such a unique case. I didn't include it in my analysis because of the European Union country. But I think it's also difficult to include a country where the democratic tradition is so different. Of course, that there's no real government and opposition dynamics in Switzerland. So I think it's very difficult to compare Switzerland. But I'm sure, Matt, you know the Swiss case very well, so you can reflect a bit more on that. But what I'm hearing here is, can we learn from referendums? Is it the case that if countries have more referendums, will the outcome then will more be a yes? Will it more often be a yes? Or will the discussion be better? I think that's also a very common argument, that if there are more referendums, we learn how to discuss topics. I should not quote, but I don't know the exact quote, but I think Sartori said something. You do not learn to vote by voting. I mean, maybe you know more. But so I think this is a very difficult argument. I think also in Denmark, discussions are not always on. It is on the European Union, but also with the Eurosceptic populist parties, debates become. How do you say that? Tainted? Is that a word? But it's not only a referendum. It's also in elections. It's the case. So I don't know whether that's a bad thing or not. Maybe. Then I think about the other points. I don't want to say that.
Yes, so I can address your points and also a few points about Switzerland. I mean, the Swiss, they vote often, and roughly there are, I don't know if I should put this one on, they vote about 16 times a year. I mean, they go to the polls 4 times a year, and in total they have referendums 16 times a year. And recently in Switzerland there was a referendum where the court said that the people had been misled and they have to revote. They've had that in Slovenia as well, which is, I'm just saying that for interest, if you like. But the Swiss also, I don't think they become, they don't learn to be sensible because they vote all the time. They've been about 13 referendums on immigration, and 11 of them have been won by the progressive side. And you would have thought, oh well, the Swiss are open, and then suddenly there's referendum on whether they should be allowed to have minarets, and they said no, we shouldn't. And they previously, back in the day, they voted I think 3 times before they gave women the vote. So the Swiss aren't angels. Just the last 2 points where he said Tony Blair never lost a referendum. Well, he did lose one about the Northeastern Regional Assembly in 2004. And I remember I lost out on a research grant because there were going to be other referendums. So therefore, I have that. It hurts a lot, that one. And then you say the thing about dictators like referendums. That's true. Pinochet have had referendums, Hitler, Mussolini, Ceausescu, Erich Honecker, and the list goes on. The difference between those referendums in dictatorships is, and I call them plebiscites, in France they call them plebiscites, is that first of all, they're not fair at all. In Nazi Germany, where they had 4 referendums, on one occasion there's a letter to, has been sent to a Gauleiter, one of the runs a concentration camp, and he's questioned, why did you only get 80% of the votes? Couldn't you, these people are in turn, they should have voted for Hitler, even if they're in concentration camps. So I think the thing about Hitler and having referendums, but then again, Stalin had representative elections. There was a parliament in Russia, and some people say we don't want to have referendums because Hitler had them. Well, would we then abolish parliaments because they have them in North Korea? I don't think so. So that's, yeah. On that note, I'll hand it on to you, Mario.
A few observations, sorry, in relation to your comments as well on the Tony Blair not having lost a referendum. I was going to say, but of course he never held a national referendum, of course, so in fact the only referendums that have been held under Tony Blair have been at the sub-national level. So in relation to the Swiss point, you introducing Switzerland into the conversation. Switzerland is of course an outlier, and Saskia excludes coverage of Switzerland from the book as an outlier, and it really is an outlier in direct democracy terms. The comments in relation to, from the lady over here, in relation to trade agreements, I would, however, for what it's worth, point out that the emphasis on the people not having had a say in relation to it and having been fighting for a say in relation to the trade agenda, I have my reservations about the extent to which the people have really been seeking to have a say, as a general point in relation to the EU, seeking to have a say about the EU's trade agenda, that there's some significant movement in that respect. But in any event, as a comparative point, I would emphasise in this respect that in which country, because one doesn't spring to mind, do the people actually have a say over that nation's trade agreements in a direct democratic sense? That is, a vote on your country's trade agreements. And one, I think, a Latin American example springs to mind where there was a referendum on a trade agreement, but otherwise, maybe it was Costa Rica, but otherwise, there may be a case for the people to have
but that was the point I was making, that was the first chance they did have to object to anything.
In the trade-related context, in the EU trade-related context, yes. So I'm not disagreeing that that was the first chance, precisely because you don't get the chance to have a popular vote on the EU's trade agreements. My point partly was just to put this in comparative context to say that there's nothing anomalous in that, comparatively speaking, but one might seek to make the case for the people having a say in future over trade agreements, not just in the EU but elsewhere, given how significant they are.
Yeah, and if I may add, because I think it's a very valid point. If you look at the Netherlands, where we're referring to, I think that one of the reasons why this referendum law was abolished was exactly because organizations already tried to organize a referendum on the trade agreement with Canada. That's the CETA agreement. So there were, of course, more reasons that this government just doesn't like referendums, but this exactly because now the voters were given a chance to vote on European Union policies or treaties. And if you never give them that choice, then they will vote no, especially in times of rising US skepticism. So it is a very valid point. And I think it's it's also where the populist left and right unite, especially on trade agreements. So I think the risk for having a referendum is even bigger in these kinds of issues.
That's a small one. I think that there's that sort of idea of people can vote by proxy as well. So you wait for that referendum, and then that's the chance you have to say you're angry. I mean, a referendum is a safety valve. And if you only allow people to let out steam so often, they would let out steam even at a time when it's not appropriate to let out steam about an issue. Now the metaphor's getting sort of a bit worn. But I think one of those interesting things where you said that we don't do predictions. I mean, I did a predictions of the Brexit referendum, and I got it right, I have to say, 4 months before, and I was honourably mentioned in the Daily Express, which did not give me a lot of friends in my department. And I said to say, I don't blame the messenger. But one of the things I did in that sort of fairly statistical paper was to look at how long a government's been in office. And basically, if you've been in office for a long time, people don't trust you and people start to hate you. So when Callaghan had been in for a long time, of course they lost the referendums in Scotland in '79. When the Danish Conservative government had been in for a long time, they lost the Maastricht Treaty in the same way as when they had their honeymoon, would win the Single European Act. So sometimes referendums are really about representative issues, and we don't like these guys. And I think David Cameron had just been in for that little bit too long. And then, Monsec Fonseca papers and other things sort of like don't really help, and then you tend to lose. And there's referendums aren't perfect, but I think you need to have them as a corrective to representative democracy.
Any other questions? I see one in the back. Yeah.
Thanks. I just want to follow on from the previous point about giving citizens a say about the topic of the referenda. In the last 2 referendums in Ireland, we had a 2-year conversation via Citizens' Assembly on both issues, and this provided an opportunity for 100 citizens to be randomly selected. Legal experts were brought in, policy experts were brought in on the issues, religious experts were brought in on the abortion issue, and then marriage equality experts were brought in on that referendum. So we had a 2-year conversation prior to the vote, and it also led to the government publishing heads of bills of legislation, so we knew we had the text in our hand before we went into the ballot box. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on giving citizens a greater say on the policy issues and more kind of dispelling the misinformation that can occur during referendum campaigns?
Any more? Yes.
Thanks. That's absolutely linked to what's just been said in the previous comment. I wondered whether you'd looked at how many, and compared how many cases where votes were conducted where the population actually knew what they were voting about and were fully informed, and compared with the extent to which people were just voting on emotion.
Another question? No? Yes, sorry. Almost missed it.
Thank you. Oh, just following on from the point, 2 points that were made, and just around sort of this issue of disinformation during sort of campaigns like UK 2016 referendum, as an example, and whether this is going to change the kind of how referendums, like whether referendums are conducted, and like change the future of referendums, and is there a sort of danger in holding referendums that we see?
Yeah, no, I really like the reference to Ireland, because I think that this example of Ireland. I think Europe, I think maybe the world even should follow this example, because I think if referendums are linked with more deliberative forms of democracy, so if you have a proper discussion between citizens, then it's much better. Then it's really, really bottom up. I think that's even better than having like a citizen's veto where the proposal is already there. So I think I can only underscore this. I think Luxembourg had this as well, right? Maybe you know it better. They recently had
Not in the same way as Ireland.
No, not in the same way, but yeah, also, and I think some nice proposals came out as well. So no, I would completely underscore this issue. And I didn't do research on whether people were disinformed. I think that there are many studies that do, and I think in many cases people, the voters are being misinformed. But then again, it's also in the normal elections, people also get misinformed. And I think it's very, and that's basically one of the pleas of my book, is to not see referendums as something completely different than normal elections. There are the same mechanisms, the same political strategies that underlie this. So we should not see it as something alternative to parliamentary democracy or elections.
Mario, Matt? Yeah.
Yes, okay. Thank you also for introducing Ireland. I'd actually jotted down Ireland in my notes in relation to the previous first round of questions. I think it may have been the lady in the front pointing to the difference, whether there's a difference when you are in effectively a constitutional system where they have more experience with referendums. And I jotted down Ireland rather than Switzerland for these reasons, because it's not as frequent as Switzerland, but it's a fascinating example in, and our nearest neighbour, right, that has been doing very interesting things in relation to the exercise of referendums. And I think there is an important distinction to be made there between having referendums taking place in an institutionalised system, not just that has constitutional regulation on a referendum or legislation on a referendum like the UK does and has had, as Saskia's book points out, since 2000, but a system that actually uses it reasonably regularly. And then there might be differences in terms of the willingness of the people to give the government of the day a bloody nose, because they're more able to see it as a referendum on that particular issue. So Ireland's a fantastic example for our purposes. On the issue, the next question about being fully informed, just voting on emotion and the like, Saskia was partly dealing with that and drawing an analogy between the national elections, but of course there is an important difference here that we have to keep in mind that Brexit brings home, of course, which is that unlike a national election where you can vote the rascals out next time round, the disinformation that can flow in the context of a referendum campaign can lead to once-in-a-lifetime decisions. If the UK leaves the European Union, can the UK, and under what circumstances could it go back in? It's not that you get another chance 4 years later, or as currently the case in the UK, it seems to be that we're having very regular general elections. And then I was suggesting in discussing Saskia's book that the concerns with disinformation and the like are likely to lead elites, particularly within the EU context, to avoid things that generate referendums. For that reason, it's quite an obvious reaction to that. If you're talking about revising the EU treaties and you know that disinformation is a problem that has been manifest in certain elections, then you're already having second thoughts about the benefits of a future treaty revision that might trigger a referendum, but you're really going to avoid it in the current setup that Europe finds itself.
Lastly on Ireland, what is interesting about the Irish case is that the Citizens' Assembly took a vote after they had deliberated, and 67th, I think it was on the marriage equality one, and 67% of the people in the Citizens' Assembly voted for the amendment, which was, I think, only 2% more than the people in the referendum after, which is, we love Ireland, we all do, and there's nothing not to love Ireland about. There's an element of schadenfreude on the island of Ireland at the moment, but that I think is fair enough. Then on the Brexit one, when people are well informed, and you said, well, vote on emotional issues. Well, emotions are okay, I think. I mean, it's okay. I mean, I think David Hume once says, reason is not only to be the slave of the passions. And I think if you have an emotional attachment to something, that is a reasonable thing too. And I mean, in the Brexit referendum, people it was spelled out to them what would happen. That did happen in some cases. But also, I think in a number of other cases, I think in the Netherlands in 2005, there was a poster which was then quickly withdrawn. It said basically concentration camps will be back. If we don't buy Germany in, we know what they're like. And that was supposed to be the rational parties that did that. I think the Liberal Party, wasn't it? Or was it? No, it was the Christian Democrats, I think. So sometimes, and we had in Scotland, you could say, then it was the other way around. I mean, Alex Salmond's First Minister of Scotland, for those who've forgotten him, always said in his campaign, we have to put a kilt around it, which is a wonderful Scottish way. But most people in Scotland couldn't care less about putting a kilt around it because they said, at the end of the day, you know, economics is more important. So maybe it's just because Scottish people are more economically rational than English people. I don't know.
On that note, it's time, I'm afraid. I thought this was excellent. I hope you will join me in thanking Saskia Hollander, of course, Matt Kvortrup and Mario Mendes for this excellent discussion. You may as well. And I thank the speakers with our famous We Merry goodie bag. Here you are. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And again, our next event will be on the 9th of December, at least the one organized by the Center for European Research. The Mile End Institute has many more events. Do you want to advertise them?
Just before you go, 4 November, Maya Goodfellow, we'll talk about the hostile environment, how immigrants became scapegoats. Then on the 11th, we're going to have a panel event, Data Rights, Subjects of Citizens. And on the 18th, we're going to have a very topical debate about Corbynomics, which probably will be a campaign-related event. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague Dr. Saguria. And on the 9th, we have our next Centre for European Research event, which will be a roundtable on what's next for British democracy.